Not if you want to believe all the counsel of God. Anyway, Galatians 3:16. We're going to talk about this all day if we're not careful. Now to Abraham were the promises spoken, and to his seed. He saith not, and to seeds, as of many, but as of one, and to thy seed, which is Christ. So God gave the promises that we had spoken about last week, and that was a promise that all the nations of the earth would be blessed through Abraham. He spoke the promises to Abraham and to his seed, and that was God doing the speaking. And Paul specifically points out here that he's not saying to seeds, which means he's not saying to various groups of people or individuals, but to one seed. And he really pulls this together for us in the last verse of chapter 3, and we'll look at that when we get there. A paraphrase of this verse could rightly read, God spoke the promise to Abraham and to his descendant. God did not use the word descendants, meaning more than one. Rather, he specifically used the phrase, and to thy descendant, which is Christ. And like I said, he really pulls this together in his summary statement of what he's getting ready to communicate to them about the promise to Abraham. Moving into verse 17. Now this I say, a covenant confirmed beforehand by God, the law, which came 430 years after, doth not disannul as to make the promise of none effect. With the words Paul used here where he said, now this I say, he is going to make a point based on what he had previously written. The law he gave to Moses does not override, alter, change, or nullify the covenant that he made with Abraham in any way, shape, or form. This is a very important point everyone needs to keep in mind. God has given a lot of promises to a lot of people throughout history. God's promises or covenants do not cancel each other out. They are not time sensitive in that a promised law or covenant given 430 years later cancels or amends a promise given previously to someone else. God keeps all of his promises, fulfills all of his covenants, and expects all of his laws to be followed in the times where they apply. We today can take great comfort in knowing that God keeps all of his promises. We do not serve a God who changes his mind, amends his laws, and makes situational promises. He is a God we can trust, count on, and depend on to do what he said that he would do. Verse 18, for if the inheritance is of the law, it is no more of promise, but God hath granted it to Abraham by promise. The Judaizers were teaching that Gentile Christians had to be identified with Abraham through Moses or the law of Moses. The result of what the Judaizers were teaching is that the promised Messiah came from Abraham only by way of Moses. God promised Abraham that all the nations of the earth would be blessed through him. The law of Moses could not change that promise that God gave to Abraham. What Paul is telling his readership here is that if the blessings promised to Abraham were dependent upon the law of Moses, then it was no longer the promise that God made to Abraham. Paul is teaching here that the law of Moses does not stand between Abraham and Christianity. If it did, then Paul is saying that in essence God would have broken his promise to Abraham, which he confirmed by swearing to himself, as we see in Hebrews 6:13. Go ahead, CL.
The promise that God made to Abraham, he said it was to all nations, but yet the law was only pertaining to one nation, the
right.
nation of Israel. But then with the coming of Christ, it changed it back to all nations, because whether you're a Jew or a Gentile, if you obey the gospel of Christ, the apostles preached, then you obtain that promise or receive it.
Right. And what the Judaizers were trying to pull off on this little deal was that they could only get to Abraham through the law of Moses. Well, God didn't give the promise to Moses. He gave the promise to Abraham. And that's what Paul is trying to get them to understand, and that's what we need to understand.
Christ fulfilled that promise.
Right. He fulfilled the promise. It was fulfilled in Him. So as to make the promise of none effect, or to make the promise void. Concerning the promise given to Abraham, Paul wrote in Romans 4:13 through 14, for the promise that he would be the heir of the world was not to Abraham or to his seed through the law of Moses, but through the righteousness of faith. For those who are of the law of Moses are heirs. Faith is made void and the promise made to no effect. Paul just a amplified statement of what Paul said there in verse 18. And I'm going to read that again. For the promise that he would be the heir of the world was not to Abraham or to his seed through the law. And that being the law of Moses. But through the righteousness of faith. For those who are of the law, and that's of Moses, for if those who are of the law are heirs, faith is made void and the promise made of no effect. Paul gives us another important piece of information here. He confirms that the promise given to Abraham did not go through the law of Moses, and he teaches that those who live under the law of Moses are not heirs to the promises. Moreover, if they were heirs, then both the gospel system of the faith and the promises given to Abraham and his descendant are worthless, or none effect. They're void. So it can't go through Moses. If it did go through Moses, then the promise that he gave to Abraham was worthless at all. It meant nothing. And then in verse 19, Paul writes, what then is the law? It was added because of transgressions, till the seed should come to whom the promise hath been made. And it was ordained through angels by the hand of a mediator. The Judaizers had been inserting the law of Moses into the gospel, and Paul had been arguing against this, and now Paul is going to explain the original purpose of the law of Moses. And he begins this by asking the question, well, what then is the law? I mean, it's not the promise, it's not part of the promise I gave to Abraham, so what is the law? What is it then? And the answer was, it was added because of transgressions, till the seed should come to whom the promise hath been made. The law of Moses was given as a means of dealing with the sins of the Israelites on a temporary basis. It was added because of their sins until the seed should come to whom the promise had been made. Earlier in verse 16, we saw the introduction of Jesus Christ as that seed of promise through which all the nations of the earth would be blessed. So we see here that the law was a temporary measure put into place for sin only until the arrival of Jesus Christ. And that is where Paul's at with this now. But in the last verse, he pulls us in together, all Christians in together with him. When the seed through which all the nations of the earth were to be blessed, the law of Moses would be fulfilled, and at that time it would be brought to an end. The term added in respect to the law of Moses did not mean something that was added to the original promise that was given to Abraham with the intent of complementing or amending the law of Moses in any way. The original language means that the law of Moses was given in addition to the promise made to Abraham and not as a necessary component of it. In other words, the promise given to Abraham stood on its own without the intercession of the law of Moses. Paul's usage of the word till in this verse was meant to teach his readership that the law of Moses had a built-in time limitation. It was never intended to be in effect as a law forever. Prophecies were given during the time of the law of Moses in order to show that it was going to be replaced by another system. And we can find those, for those of you that are taking notes, Jeremiah 31 through 34, Isaiah 2 through 4, and Micah 4, 1 through 4 are three of them, and we're not going to take the time to look all those up. Jeremiah 31 through 34, Isaiah 2, verses 2 through 4, and Micah 4, verses 1 through 4. Those are all prophecies that were given during the time of Moses that pointed to an end to the law of Moses. Paul's readership needed to understand this because the Judaizers were forcing the old law of Moses between the Gentiles and Jesus Christ. And back to the verse. And it was ordained through angels by the hand of a mediator. The giving of the law of Moses at the hands of angels is demonstrated in Acts 7, verses 51 through 53 in particular. If anybody wants to turn to Acts 7, starting in verse 51, and then in verse 53, Acts 7. All right, starting in verse 53. Who have received the law by the disposition of angels and have not kept it. Who have received the law, talking about the law of Moses, by the disposition of angels and have not kept it. Therefore, and in Hebrews 2, 1 through 3. I'm getting mixed up on my notes here. Hebrews 2, 1 through 3. If we want to turn over to that. This is very important in the understanding of the next verse, which is the one I mentioned last week. Hebrews 2, starting in verse 1. Therefore, we ought to give the more earnest heed to the things which we have heard, lest at any time we should let them slip. For if the word spoken by angels was steadfast, and every transgression and disobedience received a just recompense of reward. For if the word, speaking of the old law there, spoken by angels was steadfast. So we learn from these that the law of Moses came to us at the hands of angels. The law of Moses was given to man through the angels under the guidance of a mediator. The difference between the law of Moses and the gospel is that there were no angels between the mediator and mankind. The law of Christ was first spoken directly to man by Christ himself, and later confirmed by those who taught directly, meaning the apostles and disciples who accompanied him during his earthly ministry. The law of Moses was given. We had a mediator between God and man with the law of Moses. With the gospel, it is spoken directly by God to man. That is very, very significant in the understanding of this next verse. Galatians 3:20. Now a mediator is not a mediator of one, but God is one. When I started studying this verse, not a single one of the commentators and the people that wrote on this agreed on what this verse meant. Kaufman said that there was like hundreds of interpretations of this verse, and then he went on to say that he wasn't going to inflict his interpretation of this on the readership. And I said, right, you're a lot of help. So anyway, this was quite a little deal to try to kind of get unraveled. I meant to send this to Bobby and get his input on it, but I'm glad you didn't. This verse is a handful. To understand this verse, we need to consider a more literal translation. Young's literal translation, which is denominational, by the way, but anyway, I used it for this. And it reads, and the mediator is not of one, and God is one. The key to understanding this verse is to identify what the mediator is. Logic demands that the mediator in this verse is the same one as the prior verse. Therefore, the meaning of this verse must take that into consideration and still make sense and still be logical. In any sentence, if the terms are correctly identified, you can substitute that term with its definition and the meaning of the sentence will be the same. For example, if I take the sentence, I'm going to wash my clothes, and I substitute the correct definition for the term wash, then that sentence would mean the same thing. It would be something like, I'm going to apply water or some other liquid for the purpose of cleansing my clothes. When you substitute the definition for the term, the sentence means the same. Go ahead, CL.
Well, in worldly terms, a mediator, if you and Bobby were at odds with each other, and Carl was picked as a mediator, he tried to get you guys to come to one central idea. But Christ tries to get all of mankind to conform to God's idea.
Right.
That's for God's only one. The party that has to give in that is human. They have to give. God is not going to give. But if you two men are in disagreement, both of you are going to have to give something if you're going to come to an understanding.
That's right. Then when we back up to verse 19, we get the whole context in a more literal translation. We read, "Why then the law?" Why is the law here? "On account of the transgressions it was added, till the seed might come to the promise hath been made, having been set in order through messengers in the hand of a mediator. And the mediator is not of one, and God is one." So that is the literal translation according to Young's literal translation. The Greek word for mediator is mesoto, which means one who intervenes. And now here's where CL, what he was saying, comes into play, which means one who intervenes or goes between two. Thus it is evident that the mediator has to be Moses, since he was who received the old law at the direction of the heavenly messengers and delivered it to the Israelites. So now if we go back and substitute the term mediator with Moses, we get, what then is the law? It was added because of transgressions, till the seed should come to whom the promise hath been made, and it was ordained through angels by the hand of Moses. Now Moses is not a mediator of one, but God is one. There is a contrast here as evidenced in the overall context. The contrast is between the giving of the law of Moses and at the hand of a mediator, and the promise given to Abraham in Christ directly by God. This fact is significant if we're going to have the proper understanding of this verse. Now the task at hand is to understand the meaning of this verse so that it harmonizes with the overall context of what Paul is trying to teach his readership. We need to keep in mind, as we're working through this, the base argument that Paul is making is the contrast between the law of Moses and the system of faith under which all Christians now live. All of these things need to fit together and to harmonize so that the meaning of this verse progresses smoothly and sensibly, and the meaning must complement Paul's overall message. Keep in mind, the Judaizers were trying to insert the law of Moses between Abraham and Jesus Christ. So the conclusion here is that a mediator is not needed when God makes a covenant directly with someone. God's covenant with Abraham did not need a mediator. The Judaizers were trying to insert this mediator between Christ and his people. Paul is telling them that they do not require a mediator such as Moses in order to have access to Jesus Christ. He is teaching them that they have direct access to the supreme administrator of the new covenant. All the members of the Godhead are one, so a covenant coming directly from Jesus Christ is the same as if it had come from God the Father.